You may well know that modern special forces got their tentative start during World War II, with the likes of the British Long Range Desert Group and Special Air Service having had many words written about them over the years. But what you may not know, however, is that the Germans had their own little dabbles with special forces, the best examples of which come in the form of the Brandenbergers. And like all special forces of that nascent period, when the book, as it were, was still being written, they had some very unique ideas about how things were to be done. Interested? We certainly hope you are, because in the next 20-ish minutes, we're going to be telling you all about them. So let's begin. Guerrilla warfare, and generally thinking outside the box with tactics, was actually nothing new in the German military come 1933, and as a result, the Nazis were fortunate enough to already be in possession of some sorts who were very clued up in such things when they assumed power, chief among which was Theodor von Hippel. He had served as an officer in General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck's German East African Colonial Army in World War I, an army that, if you didn't know, waged a very effective guerrilla war in its titular colony after a combined British, Belgian and Portuguese force that outnumbered them 10-1 across the border and had earlier absolutely spanked them conventionally. Further just to his World War I experience, however, von Hippel also expanded his expertise with book learning during the Weimar period with Thomas Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who had used native Arab cavalry to great effect against the Ottomans in hit-and-run style tactics being a particular point of interest for him. This naturally gave him all manner of ideas that he was chomping at the bit to try out. Luckily for him, in 1935, thanks to Hitler's rearmament programming creating millions of uniforms that needed filling, he got his call up in the papers and hoped that opportunity was upon him. Being with the normal army at that point, he attempted to introduce many radical concepts, with his main one being the formation of a small but elite unit that was to be specifically trained to penetrate the enemy's defences prior to an invasion and then emerge from the shadows and cause all manner of martial mischief once it was underway. But that idea, while novel, generated little enthusiasm among the fuddy-duddy old-school Prussian generals who dominated the Wehrmacht at the time, for they, in their silver-haired wisdom, supposedly knew exactly how a war was to be fought, despite the fact that their traditional ideas had, lost them the last war. Undeterred, von Hippel kept on pushing his idea, and fortunately for him, an organisation that was very much open to a bit of blue sky thinking soon caught wind of it, specifically the Abwehr, or Germany's military intelligence service. They really liked what von Hippel had to say, and so they got him transferred over to them in 1937, eventually giving him permission to form a battalion-sized unit, so around 500 to 1,000 or so men, with which he could have a bit of a tinker and start bringing his vision to life. Initially called the Ebbinghaus Battalion, von Hippel began by focusing their training on all the skills he believed would be vital in the coming war. Specifically, infiltration, sabotage, the capturing and locking down of vital logistical bottlenecks, and knowing when was the ideal time to strike, i.e. early enough to cause some real headaches, but not so early that they get overrun and decimated at the enemy's leisure. Further still, in what was quite the pathetic move, it has to be said, von Hippel also took a gamble on the fact that Poland would be where the next war would start, and so he filled the unit near exclusively with ethnic Germans who had found themselves living in Poland following the post-World War I border adjustments, reasoning that because they spoke Polish and had lived experience of Poland and its culture, it would be all the easier for them to infiltrate. And so it was that the Ebbinghaus Battalion began trickling into Poland through August, ready for its trial by fire. Having crossed the border in civilian clothing, some on foot, some in cars and some by boat, the men of the Ebbinghaus Battalion all immediately made for their targets. It didn't take long for a blunder to occur, however, as the invasion, which had originally been slated to commence on the 26th of August, was delayed at the last minute to allow for one last desperate diplomatic effort to see Britain and France abandon their guarantees of Polish independence. And Ebbinghaus, of course, were already in Poland, en route to their targets. Seeing the problem? The situation was made all the more bum-squeaky by the fact that Ebbinghaus didn't have radios, as their use had been deemed a risk to their cover. This meant having to send them scouts into Poland, trying to find them without giving them away, and then either giving them the new time frame or telling them to get back to Germany. And while most of them were found, a few were not. A notable example of which was the unit that was being led by one Hans Herzner. It was bound for a railway station at Mosti in the Jablunkov Pass, and sure enough, at 4 AM, Herzner's unit swept down the hillside, and then a barrage of automatic gunfire quickly overwhelmed the mishmash of border police, regular army troops, and railway workers present. He grew concerned, however, when at 4:30 AM, the planned invasion time came and went, and the panzers were nowhere to be seen. Eventually, he got so worried that he straight up just called his commander on the station's telephone, at which point he was informed of the delay and in no uncertain terms told to get the out of there, which is exactly what he did. The Germans tried brushing this off as the actions of a crazed commander, but the Poles weren't fools and took the incident as a blatant warning that the invasion was imminent, which ended up giving them enough time to call 75% of their reserves before the actual invasion began 6 days later. Despite their initial blunder, however, the Ebbinghaus battalion's operations ended up going off pretty much flawlessly during the invasion. They blended in so well that no one was any the wiser to their presence, at least until they revealed the MP-38s that they had been keeping hidden. And rather than speaking of what they captured, as it's a load of bridges, crossroads and railway stations, nothing too exciting, let us instead tell you about what they did when they were relieved by the advancing forces, which would be mass murder and atrocities. In the town of Pszczyna, for example, 17 civilians were gunned down in the streets, among them children, and in the city of Katowice, hundreds were summarily executed, their fate sealed by naught but the fickle whims of the Ebbinghaus battalion. So wanton and extreme was their violence, in fact, the historian Martin Gilbert, in his book The Second World War: A Complete History, wrote that they had left a trail of murder across Poland. Militarily, the Ebbinghaus battalion had exceeded all expectations, and in order to keep the ball rolling and capitalise on that success, some changes were made. For starters, it was brought under direct Abwehr control, and with most books on the matter saying that before this point, while it had been an Abwehr-raised unit, it was essentially led by the regular army and integrated into its own command structure on an ad hoc basis in the field. To reflect this change, it was also given a new name, specifically Special Purpose Training and Construction Company number 800, which was intended to mask its true purpose. And while having everyone speak Polish worked an absolute treat in, well, Poland, it was recognised that going forward, other languages would be needed in the unit. And so Germans who spoke all manner of languages were found and lured into the unit with promises of glory and a very inflated pay packet. Oftentimes, these new members were other ethnic Germans who had been left behind during the post-World War I border adjustments, just as the original Polish speakers had been. There were, for example, some who came from still independent Yugoslavia, which had gained some Austrian territory when Austria-Hungary was carved up, and others who came from the occupied half of Czechoslovakia, as over 3 million ethnic Germans lived in the Sudetenland, which again was formerly Austro-Hungarian territory. And when there wasn't a handy-dandy pool of left-behind Germans to recruit from, they recruited polyglots. Say a German fella who had learned Flemish for whatever reason answered his call-up papers. If he seemed like he'd be able to handle intense training, then there'd be a good chance someone from the Abwehr would be popping down to his barracks to have a chat about a wonderful little opportunity they had for him. Do note too that at this early stage it was a purely voluntary deal. No one was forced into it if they didn't want to, although this would change later in the war. With this huge influx of volunteers changing the vibe of the unit, it was given a new name to represent that fact, and mercifully it was far less of a mouthful, being the Brandenburg Battalion, or simply the Brandenbergers for short, named for the state of Brandenburg, where it was opened. Do note too that it had naturally swelled way beyond the size of a battalion by this point, but we have absolutely no idea why they stuck with the term as part of their name, thanks to none of our other sources bothering to explain why. Brandenburgers, despite their rapid expansion, maintained an exceptional level of skill. Their rigorous training pushed both physical and mental limits with an expansive curriculum that covered foreign languages, small unit tactics, parachuting, demolitions, covert operations, vehicle handling, and proficiency with enemy weaponry. Certain subunits also received specialised training in areas such as piloting, forgery, demolitions, and camouflage. Notably, one company comprised 127 expert cross-country skiers prepared specifically for combat in the frozen landscapes of the northern Soviet Union. This unit was also uniquely equipped with dog sleds in order to navigate such harsh terrain effectively. Thanks to all of that, the Brandenburgers were ready to go when they were called upon again, which would be the invasion of France and the Lowlands in 1940. To give you some idea of the kinds of things they got up to, one notable mission involved capturing the Meuse Bridge in Gennep, which Dutch troops were planning to blow before an imminent retreat. To do this, one Lieutenant Wilhelm Walter led an 8-man team, beginning his assault at 2 AM on the 10th of May. Cleverly, he had most of his men, plus himself, dress up in Dutch uniforms, and then had everyone pretend to be a squad of Dutch military police escorting a few German prisoners, which got them nice and close to the bridge with its defenders, none the wiser to the imminent attack. But although they succeeded in neutralising 2 guard posts, 3 of Walter's team were injured, with the group coming under exceptionally swift and heavy fire. Walter, dressed in a Dutch uniform, then pulled victory from the jaws of defeat by brazenly just walking across the bridge and causing just enough confusion to have the defenders halt their fire, at which point his men burst from their cover and took the Dutch troops out in their moment of confusion. And thus the bridge was captured and its explosives disarmed. Following the conquest of France and the Lowlands, the Brandenburgers then did a whole lot of bugger all. First, they were moved to northern France to prepare for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, which didn't happen, and then they were shipped down to the bottom end of the country to prepare for Operation Felix, the invasion of Gibraltar, which again, didn't happen. But they did finally get renamed to the Brandenburg Regiment and also got training in tropical and aquatic warfare during that time, so that was nice for them. From there, all eyes were on the invasion of the Soviet Union, but that, yet again, didn't happen. At least not immediately, as some big-chinned Italian fella had decided he quite fancied getting his mitts on Greece, only to royally f it up and have to go and ask Uncle Adolf to come down to the Mediterranean and wipe his ass for him. And so the Brandenburgers were redirected for the subsequent invasion of Yugoslavia, and through it, Greece in 1941. Again, they played a small but crucial role in the campaign, rocking up in disguise the day before the attack and seizing various important things. 4 companies of Brandenburgers were also sent to Libya in 1941, again as part of a wider action to bail out Mussolini after he had bitten off more than he could chew. Interestingly, the men sent, all of whom were fluent in either English or Arabic, switched up their usual tactics by looking at what the British long-range desert group was doing and just copying them, sending small and fast units trekking through the desert, which would then appear out of nowhere, blow those stuff up and disappear back into the desert before the enemy could muster a response. They were reasonably successful in this too, enough to earn the begrudging praise of the famed General Erwin Rommel, who had originally been very sceptical of the group, seeing them as little but bandits and pirates stuffed into military uniforms. But he was nothing if not a pragmatist, and so when word got back to him of British fuel dumps randomly beginning to explode out in the middle of nowhere, he couldn't help but appreciate their unorthodox methods. Although, because we don't want to give you a false impression, it should be noted that in their desert operations, the Brandenburgers did stack up quite a few blunders. They were rarely combat blunders, however, and instead were typically logistical ones, with them sometimes not having nearly enough fuel for their mission and eventually finding themselves stranded out in the middle of the sands, destined to die of dehydration with no hope of rescue. When the time finally came to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Brandenburgers were naturally the first to cross the border once again, as they were for essentially every front that the Germans opened during the war, and you know the deal by now, seizing key infrastructure, blah blah blah. So rather than just going over that again, let's instead spend our time looking at some particularly interesting things they got up to. For starters, they put the skills they picked up in northern France to good use and conducted regular amphibious raids across the Black Sea and Sea of Azov, initially launching from Allied Romania and eventually from occupied Soviet territory. As for what they did when they made land, it could be everything from humble intelligence gathering to support future offensives by Army Group South, or their old bread and butter work once said offensives were underway. Annoyingly, all of our sources are remarkably scant on these raids, which is annoying as they sound fascinating and we would love to know more. But their most remarkable operation of all in the Soviet Union occurred in August 1942, when a unit made up of Baltic and Sudeten Germans led by Freya von Volkersam was tasked with heading deep into occupied territory and capturing the precious oil fields outside the city of Maykop in order to prevent them from being torched by the Soviets as they retreated. Sounds like standard Brandenburger fare, right? So what's so weird about this one? Well, mostly that would be how von Volkersam went about doing it, because behind enemy lines and with his men dressed up as members of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, he happened upon a group of Red Army deserters, and rather than shooting them, he instead decided to rally them for their motherland and to rejoin the fight. It sounds weird, doesn't it? Why would giving the enemy more troops be a good thing? If they were a regular unit, sure, that would be a monumentally stupid thing to do. But von Volkersam was a Brandenburger, wasn't he? He was anything but a normal soldier. Instead, he planned to use them to get into Maykop by finding the nearest officer he could on the city's perimeter upon their arrival, and ranting and raving to them about the unorganized rabble he had just had to strong-arm back into rejoining the fray, reasoning that the scene of doing so would make the officer in question lose all his curiosity about this new member of the NKVD he'd never seen before, and then bang, he'd be in, vouched and trusted for. This plan worked very well, with von Volkersam soon finding his way not just to the officer's mess of the city's garrison, where he naturally helped himself to some vodka, but also to the office of its commander, who he hit it off so well with that he even got a personal tour of the city's defences. Handy information to pass back to the Abwehr indeed. And that was just the start of it, folks, because if you recall, he was there to capture the oil fields, wasn't he? And to do so, he had a genius idea. He helped himself to a crazy amount of grenades, because what Soviet quartermaster would ever dare question a member of Stalin's loyal NKVD? Then he split them up amongst his men and had them bundle them together, attach time fuses to them all, and set them off in a specific order to simulate an artillery bombardment. Then, when the bombardment was underway, he went running to his new friend, the make-up garrison commander, and said that he had just had orders come down that the whole city was to be evacuated because the mother of all German assaults was about to come smashing over the hilltop. The garrison commander trusted him completely and ordered a full withdrawal. And when von Falkenstein relayed word back to the Abwehr that his operation had been a runaway success, the German army rolled into a Maikop that was totally deserted, save for von Falkenstein and his men. And we don't regret spending basically the whole chapter on that one story, because it's absolutely incredible. As the war rolled on, however, the Brandenburgers began to evolve and change, becoming less of a clandestine special forces unit and more of just a generic elite infantry one. Their high point was between February 1943, when they were expanded even further and were renamed the Brandenburg Division to reflect that fact, and September 1944, when, with the war now very much being a defensive one for Germany, it was deemed that special operation forces were no longer necessary, and the Brandenburgers were instead exclusively the elite infantry role, save for a single company which kept up its commando training just in case. As for how they were used, they were what the Germans called a fire brigade unit that was usually kept in reserve so that it could be rushed to the fronts in moments of crisis to plug the line and put out fires, as it were. They've been doing this throughout the entire war too, incidentally, just not as their bread and butter, with it instead being what its troops did when they weren't needed on special operations. This saw them oftentimes pair up with the Deutschland Division, an elite Wehrmacht formation that had been acting in that capacity for the entire war, and much like the Deutschland, which started out as an infantry formation and was slowly given more and more motorized and armoured elements until it was eventually reclassified as a Panzer Grenadier Division. So too with the Brandenburgers, who, after being given more and more trucks and tanks, became Panzer Grenadier Division Brandenburg in late 1944. From there, they did what the rest of the German army did. They fought till the bitter end. It's estimated that only 800 Brandenburgers survived the war, most of whom had fled west and surrendered to the British by May of 1945. The rest, quite bizarrely, went to France and enlisted in the French Foreign Legion, which saw them fight in the First Indochina War, where their skills proved very useful indeed.